Fernan, the heir of House Pellenberg, the most prosperous and influential family in the army and empire, was a distinguished student of the Imperial Academy's Magic Division, a young man born into privilege with power, prestige, and limitless wealth at his fingertips. Yet despite possessing everything others could only dream of, he was consumed by an insatiable hunger for more. His obsession with accumulating wealth so extreme that people had long since begun calling him a money hound. As usual, his days were spent buried in reports from the merchant guild controlled by his family, coldly scrutinizing every detail and harshly condemning any subordinate who failed to meet his exacting standards, making it just another ordinary, uneventful day in his predictable routine until fate decided otherwise, for tragedy often arrives without warning, and on what seemed like a perfectly clear day beneath a cloudless sky. As Fernan walked alongside his butler engaged in business discussions, a bolt of lightning suddenly tore through the heavens and struck him down without mercy, his consciousness collapsing under the shock as darkness consumed his senses, and in that fleeting moment of vulnerability, a mysterious wandering soul seized the opportunity to invade his body. Its presence alien and intrusive as Fernan struggled to comprehend what was happening, while the entity brimmed with anticipation at the thought of taking over a new vessel. And though its intentions were unclear at first, instinct soon warned Fernan of the danger, prompting him to gather the last remnants of his mana and lash out at the intruder. The clash, brief yet intense, as the invading soul proved unexpectedly fragile. Yet even in defeat, it left behind a fragment of itself that fused with him, unleashing a torrent of foreign memories that did not belong to him, overwhelming his mind and driving him into unbearable agony as his very consciousness trembled under the weight of an identity that was no longer entirely his own. In the very next moment, Fernan's awareness snapped back to reality, his senses returning as if he'd been dragged out of a distant abyss, while his butler stood nearby with visible worry etched across his face, carefully observing his young master for any sign of harm. Yet Fernan's attention was entirely consumed by the strange, floating text that had appeared before his eyes. Eerie messages that revealed visions of the world's impending collapse as countless scenarios unfolded one after another, each more dreadful than the last. And while his butler remained anxiously fixated on him, Fernan silently absorbed every detail, his mind racing as he analyzed the ominous prophecies that depicted a future far worse than death itself, until one particular vision struck him like a blade. A scenario in which he would lose every ounce of his wealth, igniting a deep and furious reaction within him since the very thing he cherished above all else was destined to be taken away. From that day forward, Fernan was often seen seated in his classroom, no longer the composed noble he once was, but someone relentlessly searching for answers, experimenting with every possible method to uncover the identity of the mysterious soul and the reason behind its attempted possession, as well as the origin of the foreign memories now embedded within him. Yet despite his efforts, clarity remained out of reach. And when the day's lecture came to an end, marked by the teacher's dismissal, Fernan quietly shut his books, a single conclusion solidifying in his thoughts, that even if he understood nothing else, the prophecies themselves were undeniably real. And as he walked away, his mind continued to churn with certainty that these visions had been perfectly accurate so far, a realization that allowed him to subtly exploit them for his own gain and profit, though the satisfaction it brought was hollow. For if the prophecies held true, then his inevitable downfall was drawing closer with each passing moment, leaving him with no choice but to confirm, beyond any doubt, whether these visions were truly absolute. A short while later, Fernan had returned to his estate, casually removing his outer garments as if nothing unusual had happened, while his butler, ever attentive, asked how the day's lessons had gone and received a calm reply that it had been no different from usual. After which the butler offered to prepare some coffee, and Fernan agreed without hesitation. Yet instead of resting, he picked up a newspaper and began scanning it with unusual focus, specifically searching for anything related to the academy, a behavior that immediately drew the butler's curiosity, prompting him to cautiously ask whether his young master had been feeling unwell lately, a concern Fernan dismissed outright, though the butler, still unconvinced, admitted that it seemed as though his young master had been troubled by far more thoughts than before, leading Fernan to question when this change had first been noticed. To which the butler replied it had begun around half a year prior, further explaining that there were moments when Fernan would simply drift into silence as if lost in thought, and other times when he would make sudden, impulsive decisions, something entirely unlike the careful and calculated person he had always been, eventually raising the possibility that these changes might be lingering side effect from the lightning strike, an idea Fernan brushed aside by insisting that those so-called strange decisions had, in fact, brought him considerable fortune. And as he continued reading, a particular article caught his attention, mentioning an individual named Ain't Armian, a detail that immediately stirred his interest as he questioned whether this person had truly enrolled in the academy. And before the butler could press further, Fernan abruptly rose and declared that he needed to head south at once, leaving the butler standing there holding a freshly prepared cup of coffee, silently wondering what could have possibly driven his young master to act with such sudden urgency. The Imperial Academy stood on an island called Bardian within the Empire, a place where much of the environment had been artificially shaped through magic, with the southern region formed into a vast wetland. And it was there that Fernan could be seen riding on horseback while his thoughts were consumed by the prophecies, 3 of which had been burned deeply into his mind. And just thinking about them irritated him, especially the one where he ended up broke and homeless. As he continued writing, he organized them clearly in his head. First, the future where Fernan Pellenberg lost everything and became a destitute outcast. Second, the future where the 72 demons summoned by King Colomo 1,000 years ago would rise again. And third, the future where Ain't Armian would save the world from those demons, a name known by everyone in the Empire, as Ain't Armian was the descendant of the founding Emperor Carlinos Armian, whose house had once established the Armian Empire alongside 5 nearby kingdoms, though over 1,000 years his family had lost much of its power, leaving behind only its legacy. Notably, the prophecies treated Ain't as the central figure, and according to them, after finishing the entrance exams, he would head to the southern wetlands instead of returning home, his true reason for joining the academy being the search for a map left behind by the founding emperor. And since the events centered around him were described in detail like a written story, the most reliable way to confirm whether the prophecies were true was to observe if he followed that exact path, which made him not only the main character of these visions, but also someone directly tied to the disastrous future awaiting Fernan. The most frustrating part being that Fernan had no idea why Ain't would eventually come to hate him. And to make matters worse, he could not read all of the prophecies, as certain sections were obscured, leaving him only with the general flow of events while the finer details, especially those involving relationships, remained beyond his reach. The official explanation claimed that Fernan had colluded with demons, yet the idea felt utterly absurd to him, as he could not imagine himself ever aligning with such creatures, and before long he arrived at the very location where Ain't Armian was supposed to be, halting his advance as he recalled that Ain't had come to the southern wetlands in search of a hidden dungeon, one that concealed a sword left behind by the founding emperor, a weapon said to carry the will of the Empire's first royal, Knight Gardner Alphenparson. And if the prophecies were indeed accurate, then Ain't Armian was without question the ideal figure destined to save the world. A thought that made Fernan let out a faint smile as he admitted to himself that he would have eliminated Ain't without hesitation if not for the crucial role he was meant to play, though irritation still burned within him at the fact that this very person was tied to his future ruin. However, at that moment, the sharp scent of blood reached him, triggering a memory from the prophecies in which Ain't had been injured by a croaker on his way to the dungeon. And the situation immediately made sense, as even if Ain't was fated to become a hero, he was still inexperienced, and facing an apex predator like a croaker at this stage would have been overwhelming. And as Fernan approached the dungeon entrance, he noted with growing certainty that everything so far had unfolded exactly as foretold, prompting him to consider checking whether Ain't was still inside, only for the situation to shift abruptly as Ain't suddenly appeared right before him, causing Fernan to pause in surprise as he questioned why Ain't was already outside and whether he himself had arrived earlier than expected. And regaining his composure, Fernan addressed him, pointing out that new students were not permitted in this area, which led Ain't to question whether Fernan even knew who he was, to which Fernan responded that there was no one in the Empire unaware of Ain't Armian's identity. And when Ain't in turn asked for his name, Fernan introduced himself, prompting a visible reaction of surprise, which Fernan met with mild annoyance as he noted that Aint's casual manner of address was inappropriate, especially considering that he was a year older. At that moment, Ain't Armian was about to speak when Fernan abruptly cut him off, choosing to feign ignorance as he casually asked whether Ain't had encountered a lizard man, only for Ain't to correct him by identifying the creature as a croaker. And upon hearing that, Fernan remarked that Ain't had been rather unfortunate, as such creatures were not easily encountered, before producing a potion and handing it over, explaining that it was of top-grade quality and far more effective than multiple low-grade ones combined. And just as Ain't attempted to respond once again, Fernan interrupted him yet again, insisting that he be addressed properly as Mr. Pellenberg, prompting Ain't to admit that he had no money to repay him, though Fernan dismissed the concern entirely, stating that payment was unnecessary and instead framing the gesture as an investment, reasoning that while Ain's family no longer held the power it once did, someone who carried the blood of the founding emperor was bound to become a remarkable figure in time. A statement that led Ain to reconsider his impression of Ferdinand Pellenberg, as he no longer seemed like the obsessive, money-driven individual others described, but perhaps someone more reasonable than expected, unaware that beneath that composed exterior, Ferdinand was inwardly fuming over the loss of such an expensive potion, something he had only parted with because the prophecy demanded it. And, as if to cover his true intentions, Ferdinand began speaking at length, remarking that Ain should consider himself fortunate. As in earlier days, any student caught trespassing would have been severely punished, and with that, the two parted ways, Ain expressing his gratitude and promising to repay the favor someday, while Ferdinand quietly withdrew from sight, watching from a distance as Ain consumed the potion, his irritation intensifying as everything continued to unfold exactly as foretold. After some time, Ferdinand made his way inside after Ain, and as he stepped into the interior, he noted with mild surprise that despite his earlier doubts, a dungeon truly existed there, and since nothing had attacked him upon entry, it was clear that Ain had already cleared it. Yet something felt off, as Ferdinand could not sense any lingering traces of mana, despite the presence of numerous magical lanterns illuminating the area. And as he picked one up for closer inspection, he quickly realized that it was absorbing ambient mana from its surroundings, identifying it as a permanent magic lantern of considerable value, which led him to question whether Ain had simply abandoned it without understanding its worth. And recalling their earlier interaction, Ferdinand couldn't help but think that Ain had appeared rather naive, even somewhat foolish, completely unlike the composed and capable figure described in the prophecies, making him wonder whether it was truly acceptable to leave the fate of the future in someone like him. According to the prophecy, Ain had entered the dungeon already injured and in poor condition, further worsened by his fall from the entrance. And elsewhere, Ain pressed forward while suppressing his pain, his entire body aching as he consumed all the potions he carried, yet his injuries remained too severe and beyond the healing capacity of the low-quality potions. But even so, he refused to stop, continuing deeper until something ahead instinctively drew him forward, where at the altar rested a single sword, an unremarkable longsword at first glance, yet one that held his gaze completely, calling out not just to his mind but to his very soul. And the moment he grasped it, a brilliant light engulfed the dark chamber, and when his vision returned, he found himself no longer inside the dungeon, but standing within an alleyway of the Imperial Academy. While moments later, Ferdinand arrived at the spot where the sword had once been, sensing faint remnants of magic, and concluding that this must have been its location, only to realize that Ain had vanished without a trace. And with everything aligning perfectly with the prophecy, Ferdinand could no longer deny its truth, a realization that extended to his own foretold fate as well. And as he rubbed his head in frustration, he came to the bitter conclusion that he was indeed destined to go broke, muttering inwardly that it was nothing more than a ridiculous future. Ain Armian, the central figure acknowledged by the Book of Prophecy, was a hero destined to protect the world from the return of demons, and at the same time, the very person tied to Ferdinand's eventual downfall. Yet even so, Ferdinand evaluated him with a merchant's mindset, concluding that Ain was undeniably a rising asset, someone worth investing in, though the idea of immediately approaching him with blind loyalty felt distasteful, as the version of Ain described in the prophecies possessed a completely different temperament from his own, someone who valued honor above wealth and material gain, which made a careless approach far too risky and potentially counterproductive, forcing Ferdinand to carefully consider how he should handle this situation, a thought that led him to mutter that dealing with someone like this would not be simple, drawing the attention of his butler, who asked what exactly was troubling him, prompting Ferdinand to call his name, Hyde, and pose a hypothetical question about what he would do if there were a merchant guild that consistently showed strong growth, to which Hyde responded without hesitation that he would invest in it. And when Ferdinand followed up by asking what if the guild's methods did not align with Hyde's personal style, Hyde questioned whether that even mattered, reminding him of his own belief that money could adapt to any style. A response that made Ferdinand pause as he realized the truth in those words, understanding that despite the grand scale of demons and the fate of the world, the principle remained unchanged, as it was ultimately a matter of investment, risk, and profit, where differences in personality were insignificant compared to the potential returns. Yet even with that clarity, Ferdinand acknowledged that he still needed more precise information about Ain before making his move, and with that in mind, he grabbed his coat and declared his intention to meet him immediately, while Hyde, clearly confused, questioned who exactly he intended to visit and reminded him that guests were expected soon, only for Ferdinand to ignore the concern entirely, leaving Hyde with nothing but a quiet sigh as he watched his young master depart. At the academy, dormitory assignments were determined strictly by entrance exam rankings, with those placed from 1st to 10th earning residence in the prestigious Ravidos Hall, ranks 11 to 30 assigned to Bless Hall, and everyone ranked 31 or lower relegated to the lowest tier, often dismissed as bottom feeders. And it was at that moment that a faint blue soul-like entity appeared, revealing itself as the ego of Gardener Alphenparson residing within Ain't's sword, its presence, radiating visible frustration as it reacted with outrage to their placement into Bess Hall, unable to accept that a descendant of the Armian lineage would be living in such a place instead of the more honorable halls above, its indignation intensifying as it imagined the late emperor rising from the grave in fury at such a disgrace. A reaction that Ain't met with a calm smile as he questioned the sudden mention of demons, which only further agitated the ego as it blamed their interference for the current state of affairs, though Ain't simply accepted the situation, acknowledging that his placement was the result of his own weakness, a statement the ego found difficult to believe, insisting that someone of Armian blood should not be so lacking. Yet Ain't countered this by suggesting that the fault lay partly with the first emperor himself, prompting confusion before he explained that the abolition of imperial succession and the transition to an electoral system among the seven great houses had gradually stripped the Armian family of its authority, compounded by the donation of most of their lands and assets to the empire, and over the centuries, especially from about 100 years ago, the imperial throne had passed into the hands of other elector families, leading to the steady decline of the Armian household, the loss of their territories, and even the disappearance of parts of their secret sword techniques, leaving Ain't in the ironic position of still being a prince. Elector in name, while lacking the means to properly train in the very skills his lineage was known for. Though despite all this, the ego remained resolute, insisting that Ain't still possessed the necessary talent, and vowing to support him fully in restoring the former glory of House Armian. Even suggesting that perhaps the late emperor had foreseen this decline and left the sword behind as a means to guide and aid him in reclaiming what was lost. At that moment, a knock sounded at the door, followed by a voice asking if Ain't was inside, prompting him to respond with caution as he asked who it was, only to be told that it was a senior. And as Ain't opened the door, he was met with the unexpected sight of Fernan standing before him, which immediately raised suspicion as he questioned the reason for his visit, while Fernan simply asked whether Ain't was currently busy, and upon hearing that there was nothing urgent occupying his time, stated that he wished to borrow a moment of it. Though he quickly added that the current location was far too public and suggested that they move somewhere quieter, a proposal that led Ain't to request 10 minutes to prepare himself, only for Fernan to complain about being made to wait, his tone carrying a sense of authority as he continued speaking until Ain't, slightly flustered, hurriedly reduced the time to 5 minutes, at which point Fernan placed a hand on his shoulder and stated that he would be waiting outside before turning and leaving without another word. And as soon as he was gone, the ego within the sword reacted with visible irritation, questioning Fernan's behavior with clear disdain. While Ain't explained that the person in question was Fernan Pellenberg, the eldest son of House Pellenberg, a revelation that only led to further dismissal from the ego, which regarded the family as nothing more than wealthy merchants and questioned what gave someone like him the right to summon a descendant of royalty, leaving Ain't to quietly wonder about Fernan's true intentions, even considering whether he had come to demand repayment for the potion. And not long after, the two found themselves seated across from each other, where Fernan's attention immediately shifted to the sword Ain't carried, asking whether he had brought it along intentionally, to which Ain't explained that holding a sword simply made him feel more at ease and insisted that it held no deeper meaning, a response Fernan accepted outwardly while internally suspecting that the weapon might house the ego of Gardener Alphenparson. And as the conversation shifted, Ain't chose to directly ask why Fernan had sought him out, only for Fernan to dismiss the matter lightly, stating that there was nothing particularly important and that he had merely wanted to share a meal together. Ain't found himself confused by the situation, while Fernan calmly handed him the menu and told him to choose anything he wanted, only for Ain't to hesitate and insist that he was fine, pointing out that the establishment was far too expensive for him to comfortably accept such an offer. Yet Fernan dismissed the concern and reminded him that one should never refuse a meal from a senior, leaving Ain't with little choice but to reluctantly begin looking through the menu despite his unease. And as the two sat in silence, scanning the options, Fernan quietly observed him, noting how naive and soft he appeared on the surface, a thought that gradually shifted into irritation as he questioned how someone like this had been capable of bringing about his downfall in the future. And breaking the silence, Fernan asked whether Ain't had any goals he wished to achieve after graduating from the academy, a question that clearly caught Ain't off guard, prompting Fernan to elaborate that most students attended the academy to build connections, Yet Ain's family had long avoided social interactions under the belief that House Armian should focus solely on rebuilding itself, which made his enrollment seem unusual. And after a brief pause, Aint responded with quiet determination, admitting that he was tired of being looked down upon as a member of a fallen family, and that even if their status had diminished to little more than a name, the Armian lineage was still royal, declaring with confidence that he intended to become a royal knight and restore his family's honor. And as Fernan watched him speak, he noticed a distinct change in Aint's expression, the softness replaced by a sharp resolve that revealed a strong will and unwavering ambition, along with a deep pride in his heritage, leading Fernan to reconsider his earlier judgment and acknowledge that Aint was not as simple as he first appeared. And by the time night had fallen, Fernan concluded that he had gained a general understanding of Aint Armian's character, realizing that while he had initially planned to test him with an offer of sponsorship, it was a move he was now grateful he had chosen not to make. Fernan reasoned that if he had pushed money onto Aint too quickly, it would have only wounded his pride, and for someone with that kind of personality, a careful balance of restraint and subtle influence would be far more effective than obvious generosity. And with a faint, calculating edge to his thoughts, he concluded that what he needed now was time to gradually build trust, as if quietly weaving himself into Aint's life, waiting patiently for the inevitable moment when Aint would come to rely on him. And when that time arrived, there would be no escape, as he intended to secure Aint as his ally and extract every possible benefit from him. And just then, Hyde entered the room, asking where his young master had gone, to which Fernan casually replied that he had simply gone to meet someone he knew, prompting Hyde to question whether it had been a Berchef, a name that immediately caught Fernan's attention as he asked why it had been brought up, only for Hyde to explain that Luina Berchef had been scheduled to visit and discuss her debt that very day, something Fernan had completely forgotten, and Hyde continued by saying that had he known his young master would be delayed, he would have dismissed her earlier, but instead he had asked her to wait, assuming the meeting would be brief, only for her to remain there for 3 hours before eventually leaving, likely under the impression that she had been deliberately ignored to discourage her. A conclusion Fernan showed no concern for her, as he remarked that it was better if she felt discouraged, noting that he had already invested significant effort into keeping her bound by obligation and suggesting that maintaining pressure would only work in their favor. But in that moment, something fell off, and as a sudden pain struck his head, he instinctively gripped it, drawing concern from Hyde, who asked if he was all right, while Fernan dismissed it as nothing more than a headache, though deep down he understood that it was not ordinary pain at all, but the onset of another prophecy. The portions of the prophecy that had previously remained hidden were suddenly revealed to Fernan, catching him off guard as he struggled to understand why this change was happening now. And within the vision, a striking image emerged of a woman with flowing brown hair, her presence both elegant and commanding, wielding a sword that appeared far more refined, noble, and almost alive compared to any ordinary weapon, while under the moonlight. Her movements resembled a mesmerizing dance that completely captivated Aint, who could not take his eyes off her. And though she clearly possessed the talent to rise as a royal knight, there was a deep darkness lingering within her heart, bound by unseen shackles that restrained her. Yet the prophecy suggested that if she were ever freed from the grip of House Pellenberg, she would be able to spread her wings and soar without limits. A revelation that immediately led Fernan to question whether this was the true reason Aint would one day come to hate him, and the realization provoked an unrestrained curse from him, startling Hyde, who momentarily froze under the impression that the anger had been directed at him. And by the following day, Luina Berchef sat quietly, lost in thought as she reflected on the previous events, unable to understand why Fernan had summoned her again after deliberately making her wait for hours, especially when she was the one in a desperate position due to her overwhelming debt, leaving her to wonder whether he intended to completely break her spirit. Not far away, Fernan stood observing her from a distance, noting even from behind the tension and frustration she carried, while recalling the history of House Berchef, once a lineage of hereditary border dukes tasked with guarding the empire's northern frontier and counted among the 7 elector families. Yet after a devastating wave of monsters brought ruin upon them, their once unshakable legacy crumbled and their former glory disappeared, forcing Berchef to sell off everything she possessed in an attempt to rebuild, even parting with official documents and the golden bull that affirmed her authority as an elector, though it still proved insufficient. And it was during that time that Duke Pellenberg, the head of House Pellenberg and Fernan's father, extended his hand to her, a gesture that might have seemed like sympathy at first glance, though Fernan knew that was far from the truth. House Pellenberg, lacking the same level of talent and swordsmanship as it possessed in magic, had long sought access to powerful and refined secret sword techniques, and the downfall of House Berchev presented the perfect opportunity to achieve that goal, as Pellenberg deliberately cut off any alternative financial support from other nobles, cornering Berchev into accepting an enormous loan from them. A move that ultimately saved the house from complete extinction but bound it in a cycle of crippling interest that continued to drain them year after year. And as Fernan reflected on this, irritation surfaced within him as he realized that if he had applied just a little more pressure, they might have already surrendered their treasured sword techniques. Yet what made the situation more troublesome was the fact that Luina Berchev was fated to become Ain't's future lover, and considering that connection, Fernan quickly abandoned the idea of pursuing the techniques further, deciding instead that the more important priority was ensuring that Luina did not come to resent him. And with that conclusion, he stepped forward, clearing his throat to announce his presence as he remarked that she had already arrived for dinner, before calmly taking a seat and offering an apology for the previous night, explaining that he had been preoccupied and had unintentionally forgotten their meeting, insisting that it had not been deliberate, though Luina showed no interest in accepting the excuse, curtly dismissing it as something the weaker party was always forced to endure, a statement Fernan attempted to counter, only for her to cut the matter short by choosing to ignore it altogether, shifting the conversation by directly asking why he had called for her, to which Fernan replied that she likely already knew the reason, while internally preparing himself as he initiated what he considered the first phase of his plan, to win over Luina Berchev. At that moment, Fernan began bringing up the topic of joint classes, only for Luina to immediately reject the idea, prompting a troubled expression from him as he pointed out that he had not even finished speaking and questioned how she could already know what he intended to say, to which Luina calmly responded by asking if he was about to propose that they partner together, following it with a blunt question of why she should even consider it, as she saw no benefit in aligning herself with him, especially given that she was ranked second in their department while Fernan stood at 10th, leaving her with far better options. Yet Fernan remained composed and presented an offer instead, stating that if she agreed to be his partner for the next 3 years, he would waive the interest on her debt, a proposal that visibly surprised her, though he quickly added a condition that she would also have to accept his sponsorship, leading Luina to question his motives, to which Fernan attempted to justify it by emphasizing the importance of joint classes, only for her to clarify that she was not asking about that, but rather why he was going so far as to both partner with and sponsor her, even pointing out that she was already attending the academy on a scholarship. And in response, Fernan revealed that it was widely known she sent most of that money back to support her family, leaving her to live more modestly than even the average commoner aside from her dormitory, and that his sponsorship was not meant to carry any special implication, before stating plainly that he simply wished to invest in her talent. A reasoning Luina found difficult to accept, as she noted that it was unheard of for one noble to sponsor another. And hearing that, Fernan quietly realized that she was much like Ain't in valuing honor and integrity above all else, leading him to counter by pointing out that while both Pellenberg and Berchev were noble houses, that did not necessarily make them equals. Even while acknowledging the long-standing prestige of House Berchev, Fernan remarked that it still could not compare to the legacy of a former royal lineage, a statement that immediately irritated Luina as she questioned whether he was deliberately trying to provoke her, while internally, Fernan remained unfazed, convinced that unlike Ain't Armian, she was someone he could control, and that regardless of her feelings, her circumstances would ultimately force her to accept his terms, prompting him to calmly state that this was not the time for pride to interfere and reaffirm that his recognition of her talent was entirely genuine, before smoothly transitioning into the next phase of his strategy by revealing that he had recently witnessed her swordsmanship firsthand, a claim that tied back to the prophetic visions etched in his memory, where her blade had been described as something exceptionally precious, beautiful, and noble, almost as if it carried a life of its own, leading him to believe that someone like her would not reject sincere acknowledgement of her abilities. Yet his words took on an increasingly intense and poetic tone as he rose to his feet, unable to restrain himself as he described how unforgettable her sword dance had been, portraying it as graceful, righteous, and mesmerizing, faster than light yet as delicate as butterfly wings, admitting that the memory of it lingered in his mind night after night, robbing him of sleep, and while he spoke with earnest intensity, Luina could only react with growing discomfort, finding his behavior unsettling and even repulsive as she demanded that he stop, though Fernan continued relentlessly, insisting that he had yet to find the perfect words to fully capture the brilliance of her technique, and overwhelmed by embarrassment and desperation to end the situation, Luina finally gave in and agreed to partner with him, bringing the exchange to an abrupt conclusion as Fernan silently marked the moment as a successful completion of his plan to win her over. after which the focus shifted toward formalizing their newly established agreement. A maid of House Berchev carefully read through the terms of the agreement, outlining 3 years of interest-free debt along with financial sponsorship under the condition that it would remain confidential until Luina's graduation. And in return, Luina was required to act as Fernand's class partner for the next 3 years, a proposal that, once fully heard, left Luina far more composed than before as she smiled lightly and admitted that it was simply too advantageous to refuse, while Fernand followed up by stating that he had recognized great potential in the way she handled her sword, a remark that immediately provoked irritation from one of the maids standing beside her, who questioned what exactly he had seen that justified such praise, only for Luina, visibly embarrassed, to downplay it by saying that he had merely acknowledged her abilities, though she could not help but recall how he had described her sword as the most precious, beautiful, and noble he had ever witnessed, while Fernand himself still seemed unsatisfied, as though he had yet to find the perfect way to express what he had seen, and this only deepened the maid's suspicion as she muttered that a man so obsessed with wealth must have some hidden agenda, especially given how sharp his eye was in identifying talent, and that this time he had clearly gone too far, prompting Luna to caution her to be more mindful of her words since he was the heir of House Pallenberg. Yet the maid remained unconvinced, insisting that his intense gaze suggested he was trying to charm her, a comment that made Luina pause as she noticed the shift in tone and teasingly questioned whether the maid herself was being swayed, though quickly denied it, clarifying that while it did not feel like seduction, the entire situation was still suspicious, particularly the fact that he had willingly given up 3 years' worth of interest just to support another household, and she further pointed out the imbalance between them, with Luina ranked second while Fernand stood at 10th, making his actions even more questionable, and just then, Hyde arrived to relay a message, informing Luina that Lord Fernand wished to see her and was waiting at the training grounds, urging her to come at once, leaving Luina puzzled as she tried to make sense of the sudden summons and what his true intentions might be. At the training grounds, Fernand stood waiting with a composed and elegant confidence, his posture alone hinting at a quiet assurance in his abilities. While it was well known that Luina Berchev had always remained second in her class, unable to surpass the top student of the second-year night department, Almond Donnertz, despite her undeniable talent, which many believed was more than sufficient to place her among the 10 royal knights of the entire continent, though there was said to be a certain darkness lingering within her, something Fernand intended to uncover for himself. And when Luina arrived, still confused by a sudden summons, he explained that he did not want her to believe there was nothing to gain from partnering with him, and that he intended to demonstrate he was not inferior in combat, making it clear that he wished to prove it immediately. And although Fernand was ranked 10th, his qualification to enter Ravido's hall already spoke of considerable skill, even if a noticeable gap remained between his rank and Luina's. Yet with a faint smile, he expressed his desire to test that very difference, prompting Luina to accept without hesitation, curious to see how he intended to justify his confidence as she allowed him the first move. And taking the initiative, Fernand began casting spells in a foreign tongue, launching a barrage of stones toward her, only for Luina to cut them down effortlessly before advancing swiftly, believing she had cornered him. Yet in a sudden shift, Fernand cast another spell and teleported away, catching her off guard. And as the exchange continued, Luina noticed that parts of the training ground had been shattered by his magic, something ordinary attacks could not accomplish, leading her to realize that his magical power far exceeded expectations as he seamlessly combined multiple high-level spells through rapid conversions, forcing her to question just how much mana he possessed, since such control and output were far beyond what one would expect from someone ranked 10th. And acknowledging that she had underestimated him, she pressed forward with renewed focus, eventually closing the distance and preparing to finish the match, only for Fernand to suddenly drop his staff and raise his hands in surrender, an action that left her momentarily puzzled until she realized he had truly exhausted his mana. And knowing that a mage without mana could not defeat a knight, she understood that she had effectively neutralized all his attacks until he ran out of energy, securing her victory. Yet despite this clear outcome, an uneasy feeling lingered within her, as if something about the entire encounter had not been as straightforward as it seemed. Fernand stated that he had a gift for her, casually handing it over as he explained that it was simply a reward for her victory, mentioning that he had heard she enjoyed chocolate, and offering her a piece of whiskey-infused chocolate crafted by his family. And although Luina tried to maintain her composure, the flicker of desire on her face betrayed how much she wanted it, prompting Fernand to remark that if it did not suit her taste, he could just as easily provide more renowned varieties, such as the famous Freudian World Tree bark chocolate, or even a rare whiskey chocolate imported from the Kingdom of Frisia, a suggestion that immediately made Luina question whether he had been investigating her personal preferences, only for Fernan to dismiss the idea, explaining that he had not looked into her specifically, but had instead reviewed information on all the top-ranking students. A response that only reinforced her point, as she bluntly told him that was exactly the issue, making it clear that she was not a child who could be swayed by sweets simply because she had won a duel, leading Fernan to offer a brief apology and state that he had only thought she might enjoy it, adding that he could take it back if she did not want it. Though when he reached out to retrieve it, Luina instinctively held onto the chocolate, and Fernan quickly pointed out that she had never actually refused the gift, allowing a faint smile to form as he remarked that they should move on, only for Luina to stop him, insisting that she needed to understand something first, as she questioned how he possessed such an immense amount of mana, capable of unleashing powerful attacks on his own to a degree she could barely comprehend, noting that with abilities like that, it made no sense for him to be ranked only 10th. In response, Fernan simply smiled and explained that a skilled merchant never allowed any single aspect of themselves to stand out too much, before the scene shifted to a later moment where he examined his now broken staff, its mana storage and amplification components completely destroyed, prompting Hyde to question what could have caused such damage, to which Fernan calmly replied that he had dueled Luina, acknowledging her strength as he explained that despite preparing thoroughly, he had still been defeated, having been pushed to expend all his mana while she endured every one of his attacks, leaving Hyde to wonder why he would go so far as to use such valuable equipment merely for the sake of that fight. Fernan replied that everything he had done was merely an investment for the future, calmly justifying his actions as he reflected that Ain't Armian's judgment had not been wrong, since Luina's swordsmanship was indeed incredibly fast, elegant, and at first glance carried a noble presence. And now that he had witnessed it himself, he finally understood why his father had been so obsessed with acquiring the Berchev family's secret sword art, acknowledging that Luina possessed remarkable talent yet, questioning why she had never managed to claim the top position, suspecting that her limitations might stem from inferior equipment rather than lack of ability, which led Hyde to ask what he intended to do about the Duke, given that the Berchev sword art had been a long-standing objective of his father, and Fernan admitted that he had not given it much thought until now, though the realization brought a hint of concern as he wondered if his father might go as far as disowning him for interfering with those plans, prompting Hyde to dryly remark that disowning him might be the least of his worries and that death could very well be on the table. A statement Fernan dismissed outwardly as he reasoned that his father would not kill his own son over a disrupted scheme. Yet despite his confidence, he chose to act cautiously and decided to send a detailed letter explaining the situation with the Berchev family while awaiting a response, even briefly imagining a more dramatic reaction such as his father fainting upon reading it, though beneath the humor lingered unease that he tried to suppress. And only a few days later, far sooner than expected, a reply arrived, stirring a moment of emotional anticipation in Fernan as he hoped for some form of resolution. But the content of the letter instead filled him with dread, as his father bluntly accused him of being possessed by a demon, leaving Fernan shaken as he realized the severity of the situation and concluded that he needed to return and speak with him in person immediately, all while knowing he could not reveal the truth about obtaining the prophetic book, since he had no way to prove its existence and feared being dismissed as a delusional merchant or accused of tarnishing the family's reputation, forcing him to consider alternative explanations that might at least justify his actions or offset the losses he had caused. And when he finally stood before his father, the man scrutinized him closely, before remarking that he seemed more normal than expected, bluntly questioning whether his son had been indulging in drugs or had simply lost his sanity. Failing to find any reasonable explanation, his father even began to wonder aloud whether the demon once slain by the first emperor had somehow returned and taken control of Fernan's body. But quickly dismissing such absurd ideas, he demanded an immediate and convincing explanation, his tone leaving no room for defiance. And in response, Fernan calmly stated that his true intention was to make an investment in the Berchev family that would far surpass the value of their secret sword art. A claim that only deepened his father's anger as he sharply questioned what possible gain could outweigh such a prize technique. Yet Fernan held his ground and admitted that he could not reveal the details of his plan at that moment, which caused his father's patience to snap completely as he declared that this was not a request, but an order, condemning his son as a sinner who had squandered the family's wealth and reputation. Though even in the face of such fury, Fernan acknowledged his mistakes, but insisted that his perspective had changed, firmly stating that if the Berchev matter were entrusted entirely to him, he was confident he could secure profits far exceeding what the sword art alone could provide, prompting his father to demand once more the source of that confidence, only to be met again with refusal. further enraging him as he declared such behavior reckless and unacceptable, insisting that this could not be dismissed as childish stubbornness, a reaction Fernan had anticipated, and realizing that he had no other choice, he reluctantly decided to play the card revealed to him through the prophecy, even though he had hoped to save it for later, offering a compromise in which he would take full responsibility for the Berchef situation in exchange for providing exclusive information known only to him, reminding his father of the personal risk management intelligence network he maintained, which his father immediately dismissed as inferior to his own, yet still ordered him to proceed. And with a composed expression, Fernan revealed that to the west of the Alaus Mountains, within the territory of Viscount Donnertz, a magic crystal mine had recently been discovered, a claim that caught his father off guard as he questioned its validity. Noting he had never heard of such a development in that region and doubting that Fernan's so-called intelligence group could uncover something his own networks had missed, to which Fernan replied with a faint, knowing remark that even children digging aimlessly in the dirt could occasionally stumble upon buried treasure, implying that luck, timing, and perspective could sometimes surpass even the most established systems of information. The butler stated that Fernan had attempted to negotiate with the Duke, and, in doing so, had begun to resemble a respectable merchant. Even so, he admitted he still had doubts about how Fernan had managed to discover a magic stone mine. He remarked that, over time, they would learn more about Fernan's intelligence squad, and that perhaps they specialized in minerals. The butler then asked about the golden pillar. Fernan's father explained that his son had always understood that minerals were a major source of wealth, which was why he had chosen to become an earth mage despite having a high affinity for fire. However, he acknowledged that they still needed to verify the information first. The butler suggested that Fernan might truly possess a golden pillar and that it was possible he had developed his organization far beyond their expectations, perhaps focusing on mines and mineral veins. Fernan's father smiled, saying that the boy had always been deeply interested in minerals and that no one would have imagined he would do something so extraordinary. But immediately after, his tone shifted, and he instructed the butler to investigate everything about the Berchef ruins and gather all details about how Luina had supposedly seduced Fernan. The butler, surprised, asked if he was implying that the young master was in love with Luina. However, Fernan's father dismissed the idea, stating that there was no reason to invest in anything that did not yield profit. If Fernan had invested in something without a clear benefit, it meant he was being drawn by something else entirely, even if he himself did not realize it. To him, it was highly likely that the boy was hiding something. After all, what would someone who valued money even more than his own father ultimately choose in life? The scene then shifted to Luina and Fernan. Fernan mentioned that Ilia Torta had partnered with Carlos Danube. Luina replied that after she agreed to partner with Fernan, Carlo had chosen to team up with Ilia instead. Fernan commented that the Torta faction had placed 4th in the Knights department. Luina clarified that they had originally been ranked 5th, but she had managed to improve their standing. Fernan pointed out that since she had already agreed to partner with him, rumors were bound to spread regardless, so he did not understand why she seemed so concerned about it. Luina thought about how everyone was saying she had only accepted the partnership because of money, something she had already expected and knew she would have to endure, even admitting to herself that they were not entirely wrong. Meanwhile, Fernan admitted inwardly that he truly loved money and believed there was nothing in the world that could not be bought with it. Luina reflected that it was no surprise, since people called him the demon of money, and that was precisely why she disliked him so much. At that moment, Fernan offered her a gift, presenting an elixir and a voucher. He explained that the elixir was made from refined mandragora roots, while the voucher could be used at the weapon shop operated by his company to obtain high-quality equipment. Luina immediately questioned his intentions, saying she would never be able to repay something like that. Fernan calmly reminded her of the sponsorship contract they had signed. She argued that even so, equipment from the Golden Turtle Company was far too expensive. From his brief reaction, it was clear even he thought the same, but Fernan denied it outright, although in his mind he admitted she was right. To him, this was simply the price of winning Luina's favor and ensuring his own future did not end in ruin. He considered the gift cheap if it meant securing a better outcome for himself. Moreover, if she grew strong enough to help him fight demons, that would only benefit him further. Luina felt overwhelmed and insisted she could not accept such an offer. However, Fernan reminded her that refusing the sponsorship would violate their contract and could result in termination along with a penalty. Angered by this, she reluctantly accepted the gift. Fernan then stood up and said they would meet later in the classroom, as he still had work to attend to. After he left, Luina continued to dwell on the situation, thinking that even as part of sponsorship, the value was far too high. She began to question whether there had actually been a penalty clause in the contract, realizing she was not entirely sure. Then another thought crossed her mind. Why would he lie just to give her something so valuable? She wondered if he was trying to seduce her in order to steal her sword. Despite her suspicions, she ultimately concluded that even if he tried, he would never succeed. The narrative then shifted to Fernan, who was searching for Ain't Armian, assuming he would be attending a lecture in the department. At that very moment, he spotted the boy. It was the first lecture for the first-year students of the Knights Department, focused on war and real combat sparring, a class known for accurately assessing students' abilities through friendly duels. According to the prophecy, Ain't Armian, who had obtained the sword carrying Gardner Alphenparson's ego, would gradually begin to stand out more and more, eventually gaining great fame as the hero destined to save the world. As Fernan observed him, a blond man approached, clearly curious about who could be important enough for Fernan Pellenberg to come all the way there. Fernan greeted him respectfully, calling him Your Majesty, and asked how he had been. The man replied that it had been a long time since they last spoke and returned the question. Fernan reflected that since this was their first meeting after entering their second year, they could afford to be slightly less formal. The blond man then asked whether Fernan had taken an interest in any of the new students. Fernan replied that he always kept an eye on those who stood out in the rankings. However, the man openly stated that he himself had come specifically to see Ain't Armian, as he was a member of one of the ancient imperial families. It was only natural that people would be curious, given that no one from the Armian family had entered the academy for over 100 years. In his thoughts, Fernan recognized the man as Rudger Schwaben, the second prince of the imperial Schwaben family. They had held the throne for 3 generations after being chosen as the ruling imperial family a century ago. Despite their current status, their origins were similar to those of the Armians, which made the relationship between the old imperial lineage and the current one extremely tense. Furthermore, Rudger was someone who deeply valued authority and was determined to ensure that the Schwaben family would continue to rule. Because of this, the existence of Ain't Armian, who possessed an even stronger claim to legitimacy, was a significant concern for him. Rudger then mentioned that there was someone else interested in Ain't as well. When Fernan followed his gaze, he spotted Vurian Kalbrudern. Rudger explained that Vurian had entered the Knights Academy as the second-ranked student of his class and was now attempting to seize the opportunity left behind by the fallen Armian family to claim a position as an elector. That was precisely why he had been closely observing Ain't at all times. Fernan considered that Varian's presence there might simply be a coincidence, but he also wondered if this moment marked the beginning of a deeper connection between Rudger and Vurian. In stories filled with heroic elements, there is always a villain the protagonist needed to overcome in order to grow stronger. After defeating such an obstacle, the hero would often reveal his past and solidify his path forward. For Ain't, the protagonist of the prophecy, Vurian was destined to become that next antagonist. Meanwhile, the judge announced that the next match would be between Anto Dnern and Ain't Armian. Fernan observed carefully, noting that Rudger and Vurian were both present at the same moment, witnessing what could very well be the true beginning of Ain's journey as a hero. He wondered if everything unfolding before him was truly fate at work. In his thoughts, Fernan recalled the prophecy stating that Ain't Armian would win this battle and astonish everyone watching. The match began as Anto charged forward aggressively. Although slightly intimidated, Ain't managed to block the initial strike with his sword. When Anto followed up with an attack aimed at his neck, Ain't reacted quickly, leaping over him to avoid the blow. Anto Dnern was known for ranking 10th in the entrance exam, making him a formidable opponent for Ain't, who had only placed 38th. Rudger watched the fight with clear disdain, expecting something far more impressive despite Ain't's low ranking. For Rudger, the fight was dull and unworthy of his attention, so he told Fernan there was nothing interesting to see and that he intended to leave. However, at that exact moment, Ain't gathered his courage, tightened his grip on his sword, and launched a sudden counterattack. The strike was incredibly fast, catching his opponent completely off guard and slicing part of his clothing. This unexpected move shocked everyone watching and immediately drew their admiration. Anto Dnern began to reconsider the situation, realizing that he might have underestimated Ain't from the very beginning. His own aggressive opening had thrown Ain't off balance, but it had also exposed his inexperience. Even so, Anto tried to remain composed, yet he could not accept the idea of losing to someone ranked 38th. Overcome with frustration, he released a dense aura, revealing his anger and determination. Among the spectators, some began to comment that Ain't was far more capable than they had initially thought. However, others reminded them that he had still failed to protect his imperial family and that someone ranked 38th would not change much in the grand scheme of things. Rudger admitted that it was impressive for someone ranked 38th to force the 10th ranked student to release his aura. He remarked that, at the very least, Ain't lived up to the Armenian name. He added that even without exceptional talent, Ain't was clearly putting in great effort. Fernan, however, disagreed with that assessment. He believed that Ain't Armenian was not someone lacking talent. On the contrary, he was someone who had never received proper support despite his extraordinary potential and, according to the prophecy, was destined to become the central figure of the story. The battle continued fiercely until Ain't managed to maneuver behind Anto and disarm him, taking his sword in a decisive move. With that, the judge declared Ain't Armenian the winner. The crowd buzzed with disbelief and excitement, discussing how he had managed to defeat Anto Nern in such an unexpected turn of events. Fernan reflected that the prophecy had once again proven true and felt a sense of relief that he had chosen to support Ain't. He understood that he needed to secure Ain't as his ally as soon as possible. His next objective would be to defeat Luina and further solidify his plans. Meanwhile, some onlookers glanced at Fernan and Luina, whispering among themselves and questioning whether the two were actually a couple, unable to understand why Luina would choose to associate with someone like him. Fernan realized that they were starting to draw attention, but Luina maintained her composure, thinking that sooner or later people would lose interest and stop talking. Fernan, meanwhile, couldn't help but worry about whether she had actually used the elixir and upgraded her equipment. Despite trying to ignore him, Luina felt a quiet excitement. She had already changed her equipment and was even more thrilled after taking the elixir, as she could clearly feel herself becoming stronger. Even though she tried to act indifferent, she admitted to herself that while the gesture hadn't been anything extraordinary, it also hadn't been unpleasant. At that moment, a woman appeared and remarked that everyone had already formed pairs and that no one seemed to be late for a class. She introduced herself as Professor Rosalia from the Magic Department and explained that from now on, the Magic and Night departments would be holding joint classes. She announced that their first activity would be a practical lecture and instructed the assistants to distribute maps to all students. Another instructor, Professor Grad, explained that the best way to learn was through real combat experience. The students would be sent to a designated training field and would need to reach a marked destination on their maps in exactly 4 hours. Not earlier and not later, but precisely at 2 p.m. When asked if there were any questions, one student raised a concern about whether this exercise would affect their grades. Professor Rosalia confirmed that it would, stating that this activity was one of the most important evaluations aside from the midterm exam. Another student then asked if conflict between participants was allowed, and she replied that capturing other students would earn additional points. With no further questions, she wished them all good luck and teleported everyone to the training area. Upon arrival, Fernan quickly scanned his surroundings, trying to determine their location, while Luina immediately pointed out that their priority should be to examine the map. As they moved through the training field, carefully assessing their path, Fernan and Luina soon noticed two figures ahead of them. Fernan quickly recognized the two figures ahead as Jane Hawks and Ned Fallon, classmates who were likely ranked outside the top 70 overall. Luina asked whether it was really worth wasting time fighting opponents of such low rank, questioning the benefit of engaging them. This time, Fernan agreed with her reasoning. However, Luina then suggested that before anything else, they should secure some easy bonus points by defeating the pair and then use the map to determine their exact location. Fernan asked if it wouldn't be more efficient to use magic for that purpose, but Luina pointed out that there was no spell capable of pinpointing their precise location. He clarified that he didn't mean it literally, suggesting instead that they could climb to a higher vantage point to get a clearer view of the terrain. Luina dismissed the idea, saying it wasn't much different from simply relying on a map. While they were still talking, Ned quietly suggested to Jane that they should run away, but before they could act, Luina charged forward decisively, intent on securing the extra points. She gave them no opportunity to escape, and together with Fernan, they defeated the pair with ease. After the brief encounter, Fernan mentioned that there was a defensive spell placed on the participants' maps to prevent serious injuries. Luina responded that if she had known that earlier, she wouldn't have held back so much. Fernan found that amusing, pointing out that her version of holding back had nearly knocked them unconscious. Meanwhile, the professors overseeing the exercise observed that eliminations were occurring faster than expected. Rosalia noted that no student had been defeated by monsters so far and found it interesting that all eliminations were the result of clashes between students. Grad then asked if there was any particular pair she was interested in watching. She replied that, based purely on rankings, the strongest pair was Rudger Schwaben and Almond Donnerts. She also mentioned that the duo of Carrillo Denev and Alia Torta was another combination worth keeping an eye on. But without a doubt, the pair that caught the most attention was Luina and Fernan. The professor remarked that their partnership was already causing quite a stir among the students. He observed that Luina, who was usually highly competitive, might actually be putting herself at a disadvantage by teaming up with Fernan, which only made others more curious about her motives. Some assumed it was simply for financial reasons, but at the same time, Fernan did not seem particularly concerned with grades. Rosalia explained that there was likely another reason behind their partnership. She described Fernan as a very peculiar student. He consistently remained within the top 10 rankings, which in itself was unusual. Typically, a student would either be exceptional and dominate the top position or fluctuate in ranking. However, in Fernan's case, his written exam scores were nearly perfect, while in practical exams he would always lose just enough points to maintain a steady average, carefully avoiding drawing too much attention. She suspected that he was deliberately concealing his true abilities. Grad was surprised by this and asked if she was certain. Rosalia reminded him of the recent incident where part of the training field had been destroyed and the faculty had been trying to identify those responsible. It had actually been Fernan and Luina, which explained her growing interest in them. Grad then questioned why Fernan would go to such lengths to hide his abilities. Rosalia admitted she did not know the reason, but added that what intrigued her even more was why Fernan had suddenly stopped hiding them. The scene then shifted back to Fernan, who was carefully analyzing the map, trying to determine their current location. He concluded that they were most likely in the Western Mountain region. Meanwhile, Luina, having already defeated several more participants to accumulate bonus points, asked if he had figured out where they needed to go. Fernan confirmed that he had, explaining that their destination lay to the northeast. He then asked her to help him locate their next targets so they could earn even more points. Luina agreed, noting that they still had plenty of time and should make full use of it. However, at that very moment, an unexpected attack was launched at them without any warning. Fernan managed to block the incoming strike just in time. As they identified the attackers, they realized it was Kirillo Denev and Alia Torda. Luina was immediately outraged by the sudden ambush and questioned Kirillov's honor for resorting to such tactics. However, Kirillo coldly replied that he saw nothing dishonorable in real combat, reminding them that the professor had clearly stated this was meant to simulate genuine battle conditions. He added that after what had happened earlier, he had no intention of letting Luina walk away without facing him. Confused, Luina asked why he seemed so angry. Fernan quickly deduced that it was likely because she had refused to partner with him for the exercise, and that his wounded pride was the true source of his frustration. Even so, Fernan found his behavior childish and couldn't help but feel disappointed that someone so capable would act in such a petty way, a remark that only made Kirillo visibly more embarrassed and furious. At that point, Fernan understood that a confrontation with Kirillo and Alia was unavoidable. Luina, however, showed no concern and even remarked that the situation was ideal, since defeating such a strong pair would earn them a large number of bonus points. Still, facing opponents of that caliber meant Fernan would have to contribute seriously. Although he found the situation somewhat tedious, he agreed to cooperate. Luina pointed out that they had not even coordinated their strategies yet and questioned how he expected to be of help. Fernan calmly replied that since they were now partners, they would simply have to fight together, telling her not to overthink it and to focus on doing her best. Meanwhile, observing from afar, Rosalia commented that a major clash was about to unfold. Grad asked if the students had encountered monsters, but she clarified that there were no monsters in that region. Instead, she explained that two of the pair she was most interested in had run into each other. With clear excitement, she added that this battle would finally allow her to witness the true abilities of Fernan Pellenberg. On the battlefield, the fight remained evenly matched. Luina began to notice that her body felt unusually light, which led her to suspect that Fernan was supporting her with some kind of magic. She wondered how he was managing to cast so many spells at once. Fernan, noticing her gaze, simply gave a small wink as if confirming it, which only irritated her further due to his boldness. Even so, she knew this was not the time to lose focus. Her priority was to defeat Alia. During the clash, Kirillo managed to trap Luina, creating a perfect opening for Alia to deliver the finishing blow. However, at the critical moment, Luina suddenly vanished and was replaced by a stone. Fernan had successfully teleported her out of danger just in time. When they regrouped, Luina angrily demanded to know how he had done it. Fernan calmly explained that it was a technique recently developed by his family, one he had learned personally. The spell allowed two objects of equal weight to be swapped instantly. This explanation only made Luina more furious, as it implied he needed to know her exact weight to execute the spell. Fernan tried to defuse the situation by saying that such information was simply listed in the student records, but that only made things worse. Luina snapped, insisting that those records should be destroyed immediately. In the heat of the moment, she even threatened to track down the document and burn it to ashes. Despite the tension between them, Fernan quickly refocused on the battle and stated that he would handle Alia, asking Luina to concentrate on holding off Carrillo. As he observed his opponent, Fernan began to question why Carrillo had not yet used his specialty. Carrillo was known for his ability to summon a rain of lightning or a massive pillar of light formed by dozens of electrical discharges, a technique referred to as multicasting. This power far exceeded the standard level expected of students and was precisely what made him one of the strongest in the department. However, Fernan had already studied ways to counter that attack and now intended to test whether his strategy would actually work. In the next moment, Carrillo unleashed a powerful beam of lightning straight at Fernan, causing everyone watching to fear that he might be killed instantly. However, when the smoke cleared, Fernan stood completely unharmed. Carrillo was visibly shocked, unable to understand how his attack had failed to do any damage. Fernan then calmly explained that he was using small devices capable of storing and absorbing mana. He added that he had personally modified them to increase their efficiency, even though they were extremely expensive and difficult to produce. Still, he believed the results justified the cost. Carrillo immediately accused him of cheating for relying on such artifacts. But Fernan responded without hesitation, asking what exactly was cowardly about it, and reminding him that the professor had clearly stated this was real combat training. This response left Carrillo momentarily speechless and deeply embarrassed, as those had been his own words at the beginning of the fight. Meanwhile, Luina seized the opportunity created by the distraction and launched a decisive attack against Alia, defeating her completely. Elsewhere, Rudger observed the situation and commented to his partner that only 2 of the 4 participants remained, concluding that the others had been eliminated and teleported out by the instructors. His partner noted that very few students were capable of blocking Carrillo's lightning magic, making Fernan's feat particularly impressive. Rudger, however, was not surprised. He stated that Fernan had always been careful to avoid drawing attention, deliberately concealing his true abilities. Now, paired with Luina, he would no longer be able to hide his strength, as he needed to match her level in combat. If he revealed everything he was capable of, his ranking would undoubtedly rise significantly. Rudger then reflected on his own position, recognizing that he was surrounded by rivals who would take advantage of any weakness if his rank were to fall. Because of this, he could not allow someone like Fernan, a potential threat, to act unchecked. He reasoned that by leading others, he could safely reach the destination while maintaining a high ranking in the exercise. However, before that, there was one pair he needed to eliminate: Luina and Fernan. Meanwhile, unaware of this, Luina and Fernan continued advancing along the route, defeating monsters they encountered along the way. They were almost at the destination, which explained why the number of creatures had increased significantly. Luina remarked that despite that, they seemed to have arrived at just the right time and might even secure first place. Fernan, however, was distracted, focusing on collecting troll blood. Luina found it odd and questioned whether that was really necessary. Fernan explained that troll blood was one of the most important ingredients for making potions. She dismissed it, saying it was nothing compared to his wealth and amounted to mere pocket change. But Fernan replied that money was money, regardless of the amount. She shot back that this was exactly why everyone called him the money demon. Fernan agreed without hesitation, adding that it was precisely because of that mindset that he had managed to recruit Luina, making their partnership highly profitable for both of them. He then asked how many pairs they had defeated so far. Luina replied that they had taken down 8 pairs, and that she was still aiming for a big bonus. Fernan commented that she had completely lost control in her pursuit of points, and Luina retorted that it was still better than being obsessed with money. She added that she had her own reasons for wanting to remain the top student at the academy. At that moment, they noticed a large group approaching. Fernan quickly estimated there were at least 20 people and immediately realized that they were all targeting the 2 of them. Without hesitation, the attack began. Suddenly, Alman lunged at Luina, catching her off guard as she hadn't expected him to be there, while Rudger charged straight at Fernan. After a powerful clash, Rudger admitted that he had originally intended only to observe him, but Fernan had already eliminated half of his followers in an instant. He noted that Fernan seemed to be taking the test very seriously. Fernan replied casually that he just wanted to achieve first place at least once in his life, but Rudger dismissed that idea, stating it would not happen. He proposed resolving the situation peacefully, pointing out that there was less than an hour left before the end of the test, and that if they continued fighting there, none of them would be able to complete it. However, Luina immediately rejected the suggestion, declaring that she would rather die than give up on a good fight. Fernan ultimately agreed with her. Rudger, smiling calmly, concluded that negotiations had failed and that they would now see what each of them was capable of. However, before the battle could resume, all of them suddenly found themselves trapped within a magic circle. Massive earth barriers rose around them, forming a perfectly constructed trap, so precise that even Luina was left in disbelief. Rudger quickly understood the situation and, realizing there was nothing they could do to escape, admitted they were finished and suggested they try again another time. Elsewhere, the professors observed the outcome and commented that the group had done an excellent job. Soon after, they proceeded to announce the results of the test. Luina and Fernan had secured first place, while Rudger and Ullman came in second. Fernan watched with satisfaction, pleased that they had achieved the top rank. Luina, still surprised, pointed out that they hadn't even managed to defeat Rudger and Ullman directly in combat. Fernan explained that what truly mattered was the final score, not who they had personally defeated or lost to. Hearing that, Luina became excited, admitting that it was the first time she had ever finished in first place and that it felt incredible. Professor Grad then informed everyone that they would soon return to the academy and instructed them not to wander off, officially concluding that phase of the training. Afterwards, Luina asked Fernan if he knew the new student, and he replied that anyone there would know ain't Armian. She revealed that she had met him one night during training, in a moment that reminded her of when Fernan had secretly watched her practicing her sword. However, this time, Fernan grew concerned because it was connected to the prophecy and another hidden part of it had just come to light. According to the prophecy, Ain't Armian would reach out to Luina and invite her to become his knight. But Luina had refused. Fernan began to question what that deviation meant and recalled the ominous part of the prophecy, one that spoke of sky dyed red like blood, a suffocating miasma spreading everywhere, and a monstrous evil, like the end of the world itself, approaching Ain't Armian. He also remembered that in that vision he had seen the back of a noble knight standing before him, which made him question whether the story had already begun to change. Elsewhere, it had been written that Ain't Armian had once invited Luina, but she refused. Now, however, after learning who he truly was and understanding the reason behind his fight, that was supposed to be her destiny. It was said that a knight must serve as both the sword that strikes down their lord's enemies and the shield that protects them. The vision then showed Luina attacking the demon Andromalius, as a brilliant blue aura surrounded her body. Suddenly, Luina was seen lying in a bed, unconscious, while Ain't stood beside her, his eyes burning with fury as he blamed those responsible for trying to destroy her and her home. He declared that the culprits were the Pellenbergs, a wealthy and corrupt family. Hearing this in the vision made Fernan even more irritated, as he recalled Ain't speaking those very words. When Fernan opened his eyes and returned to reality, he saw Luina standing in front of him, asking if he was all right after suddenly fainting. He quickly got up and reassured her that everything was fine. The professors suggested he should go to the infirmary, warning that he might have overused his power. However, Fernan couldn't focus on that. His mind was consumed by the realization that Ain't had already begun to see him as an enemy. He questioned why he had received another prophecy, especially one connected to Luina, and began to suspect that it was showing events that would soon come to pass. If that was true, then the demon Andromalius, one of the 72 demons, would truly appear in their world. The scene then shifted to Hyde, who praised Fernan for achieving first place in the test. Fernan responded that he was exhausted from expending so much energy, and Hyde advised him to get some rest. Yet even as he rode back in the carriage, Fernan could not stop thinking about Andromalius. He remembered that Andromalius was described as one of the 72 demons, appearing as a man with black hair and black eyes, with a snake coiled around his right arm. No matter how much he searched through his books, that was all the information he could find. The war against the demons had taken place about 1,000 years ago, so it was only natural that detailed records no longer existed. In the present day, the existence of demons was often treated as nothing more than a myth. 1,000 years earlier, they had completely vanished after being defeated by the Emperor and had never been seen again. Even so, Ain't Armian continued to protect everyone from any potential threat. The real problem, Fernan realized, was that Luina would be severely injured in that future battle. He kept wondering whether he should tell her the truth, but even if he did, he doubted she would believe him. He recalled a previous attempt to bring up the topic, only for her to ask if he had lost his mind. When he had asked whether she believed in demons, she had questioned why he was suddenly bringing it up. He had insisted on an answer, and she had replied that of course she believed in demons, since the empire itself had been founded after defeating many of them. However, when he asked if she thought demons still existed in the present, she had mockingly asked if he had hit his head during training. In the end, he realized she saw him as nothing more than a lunatic. He thought that if he could obtain concrete proof of a demon's existence, he might finally be able to convince her. Then he remembered a crucial event from the prophecy. Exactly 1 month later, during a training match for the first-year knights, Ain't Armian would defeat Vurian, the second-ranked student. After that, no one at the academy would be able to stand against Ain't. However, despite that victory, the true loss would fall on Vurian, who would end up becoming possessed by a demon. That moment would mark the arrival of the first demon, and its descent was drawing dangerously close. He believed that if he could take advantage of that incident, convincing others would become far easier, as undeniable evidence would present itself and serve as the perfect foundation to advance his plans. Yet uncertainty gnawed at him, for the prophecy failed to reveal when or where the demon would seize Varian's body, leaving him restless and frustrated. He questioned whether that missing piece would unveil itself when the time came, or if some unknown condition had to be fulfilled before the vision could be granted. The focus then shifted to Ain't, who studied the test results and acknowledged that Fernan Pellenberg had truly lived up to his reputation while continuing to fight alongside Berchef. Ain't Armian observed that, with support from Berchef, the Pellenberg name had managed to avoid disgrace, though Ego dismissed any comparison between the two families, insisting that only the former emperor of the Berchef lineage was worthy of standing beside him on the battlefield. Even so, Ain't noted the rising admiration for the Pellenberg in the present era, a sentiment that Ego believed explained the flawed state of the world. His thoughts drifted back to the war 1,000 years prior, recalling how financial backing had forced him into an uneasy alliance with those he deemed unworthy. Soon after, Ego proposed that Ain't seek financial support from Fernan, reasoning that the Pellenberg sought influence over the Armian name through subtle trust building before tightening their hold completely. Resentment burned within him as he reflected on the complete downfall of his own family, questioning what more could possibly be taken. Despite that bitterness, Ain't could not forget the moment Fernan had offered him a potion after he was injured by a monster, remembering clearly that there had been no trace of cold calculation in his eyes. There had been genuine concern in his expression, and to Ain't, the idea of asking such a person for money felt disgraceful, as trust was never something that could simply be purchased. Ego, however, dismissed this hesitation, viewing it as naivete, and recalled how even the former emperor had valued the reassurance that came with powerful financial backing. He reminded Ain't that he himself had once aligned with the Pellenberg for something as trivial as a meal, suggesting that Fernan would likely hand over the funds without hesitation, almost as if he had been waiting for the request. Not long after, Ain't Armian found himself in conversation with Hyde, pressing to know why a meeting with Fernan was being denied. Hyde explained that the young master was juggling responsibilities within a merchant guild alongside his studies, leaving him with little room for visitors. Despite this, Ain't asserted that he was no ordinary guest, but a member of the Armian name, and urged Hyde to relay that distinction once more. Hyde assured him the message had already been delivered, yet the response remained unchanged, with Fernan citing his overwhelming schedule and suggesting another time. Left with no choice, Ain't departed, reflecting on Ego's earlier confidence and realizing that instead of securing support, he had only inconvenienced Fernan. Elsewhere, Fernan pondered the encounter, finding the situation oddly unexpected, as his plan had not been particularly enticing, nor had he anticipated Ain't Armian approaching him first. When Hyde returned after carrying out his instructions, he questioned why someone of such interest had been turned away. Fernan reasoned that it felt unnatural, as most who approached the Pellenberg carried hidden intentions, whereas Ain't did not seem like someone who offered favors so lightly and appeared reluctant to even be there. Hyde wondered whether such effort was truly justified for someone from fallen imperial lineage, but Fernan saw undeniable potential in Ain't, believing he could become a valuable ally. With that in mind, he instructed Hyde to gather every elixir stored in the family's main warehouses, a decision that drew immediate concern, as Hyde warned that such a move would come at an enormous financial cost. Even so, Fernan resolved that he would simply present something of greater worth, convinced that anything in this world could be obtained with enough wealth, and that failure only meant the price had not yet been high enough. The scene then shifted to Ain't's residence, where Ego questioned the purpose of the Pellenberg butler's visit. Ain't explained that the man had merely delivered a box along with a note before departing. Ego assumed it was an apology, remarking that the young master at least seemed to understand responsibility. As Ain't unfolded the letter, he learned that the elixir inside had been prepared solely for him. and the moment he opened the box, shock overtook him, immediately catching Ego's attention. Curious, Ego pressed him for the cause of such surprise, only to discover that the box contained the heart of a holy bird, a sacred being whose radiant power had been infused into the ingredient. It was an elixir perfectly suited for both military application and swordsmanship, as it harnessed the force of light itself. Ego noted that even without receiving any money, the visit had proven more rewarding than expected. At that point, Ain's composure broke, tears welling up as he struggled to comprehend why someone like Fernan would place such value on a person he considered worthless, driving him to resolve that he must push himself even further to repay that faith. The focus then shifted back to Fernan, who inquired about the outcome, and Hyde reported that Aint had emerged victorious over Varian. While Varian's swordsmanship had been superior, Aint's aura had stood out remarkably. Fernan recalled that the prophecy had foretold a unique victory and questioned whether the elixir had influenced the result. Though he admitted it likely played a role, Hyde pointed out that it sounded as if Aint might have won even without it, to which Fernan could only concede that such a possibility could never be known with certainty. Even so, he continued to dwell on the prophecy, which foretold that Varian would soon fall under demonic possession, a development that, to him, represented the perfect chance to secure undeniable proof of Demon's existence. With that in mind, he instructed Hyde to closely monitor Varian, determined to uncover where and how the encounter with the demon would occur and to understand the exact method by which it would attempt to take over his body. At the same time, Fernan could not shake the question of how a being that had vanished 1,000 years ago could resurface in the present world, making it clear that he wanted every possible detail about Varian reported without exception. Not long after, Varian was seen in town exchanging his sword, only to suddenly clutch his stomach and rush off in distress, a pattern that repeated itself even during training sessions, where he would abruptly halt and run off again. 2 weeks passed under constant observation, yet nothing of significance took place, leaving Fernan restless as he lay in bed, unable to make sense of the situation. He felt certain that something crucial should have already occurred and began to question whether Hyde's investigation was thorough enough or if the prophecy itself was flawed regarding Varian's possession. His doubts deepened when he recalled that the report merely mentioned an embarrassing digestive condition, a detail that only heightened his suspicion. For Fernan, the appearance of the demon was the most critical element of the prophecy, and if that proved false, then the credibility of everything else would come into question. He then revisited the sequence described in the prophecy, remembering that after his defeat by Aint, Varian would be consumed by frustration and later seize an opportunity during the semester exams to launch a surprise attack from behind, only for the outcome to already be predetermined, ending in his complete defeat after a prolonged struggle. It was said that at that precise moment, a dark presence would begin to overtake Varian's body, and as this realization struck him, Fernan jolted awake in alarm, wondering if morning had already arrived. He could not even recall when sleep had taken him, only realizing that fragments of the prophecy had begun to reveal themselves within his dreams. Despite the confusion, a sense of satisfaction settled in, as he had finally pinpointed the exact moment Varian would fall to demonic possession, immediately after his defeat during the midterm exams, which were taking place that very day. Just then, Hyde entered, noting how unusually early the young master had risen and asking if he wished for breakfast. But Fernan was already preparing to leave, intent on observing the first-year Knights Department's exam. He stated that he required an escort and asked Hyde to accompany him, only to learn that Hyde had been summoned to the Duke's estate. Though Fernan initially brushed it off and considered taking someone else, Hyde questioned who that could be, given his lack of close companions, prompting Fernan to conclude that he could simply rely on someone whose loyalty had effectively been secured with money. The scene shifted to Luina, who questioned the necessity of an escort for what was supposedly an elixir-related errand. Fernan explained that any delay would diminish the elixir's effectiveness, making immediate action essential. Luina hesitated, citing her need to prepare for her own exams. But Fernan countered by offering to suspend the interest on the Burchef family's debt for several months after graduation, a proposal that quickly changed her mind and led her to ask about their destination. He revealed it was the northern mountainous region, only for Luna to point out that the area was currently designated as the freshmen's midterm exam site, meaning they risked punishment if discovered. Unfazed, Fernan insisted that money could resolve any obstacle and mentioned that the supervising professor was notably accommodating, a trait he found particularly convenient. Even so, Luina insisted on returning to the dormitory to retrieve her sword, which irritated Fernan as he questioned how a knight could waver after agreeing, though she calmly explained that she had simply forgotten to bring her weapon. With little patience left, Fernan ordered her to retrieve it as quickly as possible. Afterward, Fernan considered the necessity of staying concealed to avoid drawing the attention of professors or their assistants, fully aware that even with a few bribed instructors, moving around openly would invite serious trouble. Luina pointed out that recognizing the risk did little to justify deliberately walking into it, suggesting that such awareness only made the decision more reckless. As Fernan studied the map to determine their route, he noticed that Ink currently held second place within the department, closely trailing Vurian in third, prompting him to wonder if the two had already crossed paths. Luina, glancing at the map, questioned whether it wasn't the same model used by the faculty, noting that possession of such a tool violated student regulations and idly wondering just how much he had paid to obtain it. Fernan ignored the remark, simply urging her to follow him without further discussion. Suddenly, a sense of unease washed over him, and moments later, Luina picked up on a distant, unsettling noise, questioning whether it might be the cry of a monster, which only deepened Fernan's concern about what could be unfolding ahead. Without hesitation, Luina insisted they investigate immediately and rushed forward, leaving Fernan to follow behind. Upon arriving at the scene, she found a boy lying unconscious, clearly the victim of a recent monster attack, though the defensive magic embedded in the map he carried had spared him from severe injury. Even so, something felt off, as the creatures in that region were not known for such aggression. When Fernan caught up and took in the situation, realization struck him that events had begun unfolding far earlier than he had anticipated, filling him with regret for not verifying Varian's condition sooner. At that very moment, tension spiked as several monsters suddenly charged toward them. Luina reacted instantly, slicing off one creature's arm with a clean strike. Yet her confidence faltered when it continued advancing as though unaffected, leaving her unable to comprehend how it could still possess such strength despite its injury. At that instant, Fernan acted without hesitation, manipulating the earth beneath the creature to hurl it into the air before driving multiple stone spikes into its back. Luina quickly leapt away to avoid the impact, as the monster was sent crashing headfirst into a nearby tree. Fernan calmly explained that the creature had entered a berserk state, rendering it incapable of feeling pain, and noted that such monsters would attack anything indiscriminately, leaving decapitation as the only reliable way to bring them down. His thoughts briefly drifted to the prophecy, which had warned of monsters across various regions falling into madness due to a demon's influence. Elsewhere, as instructors struggled to manage the sudden outbreak, Vurian seized the chaos as an opportunity, launching an attack on Aint while drawing upon the power granted to him by a demon. Faced with such overwhelming force, Aint was pushed to his limits, ultimately awakening his true potential in the midst of battle. Back at the scene, Fernan continued piecing everything together, though Luina grew increasingly irritated as he seemed more amused than concerned, forcing him to refocus on the immediate threat before them. Meanwhile, the battle between Aint and Vurian reached its conclusion, with Vurian collapsing to his knees as Aint turned away, making it clear the fight was already decided and no longer worth continuing. The silent dismissal shattered Varian's pride, leaving him questioning where Aint was going despite the duel ending so abruptly, and the realization of his defeat weighed heavily on him. Thoughts of disappointing Rudger and his own father flooded his mind, along with memories of being compared unfavorably to his younger brother, intensifying his fear of losing his place as heir. Consumed by anger and desperation, he resolved to win at any cost and charge forward once more, only to be defeated again with ease. After overcoming him yet again, Aint could not help but question his stubbornness, as Vurian, despite his weakness, refused to accept defeat with any semblance of dignity, reducing himself to nothing more than a disgrace in the eyes of knighthood. That was precisely why he chose to walk away, deciding it would be enough to leave the body behind for the instructors to eventually discover. Elsewhere, Luina urged Fernan to abandon the elixir altogether and focus on escaping as quickly as possible to alert the instructors about the situation. Fernan, however, refused to yield, insisting that giving up on the elixir was not an option and declaring that they would force their way through the swarm of monsters and continue westward. Luina could hardly believe what she was hearing, beginning to question whether he had completely lost his senses, even suspecting that he might have anticipated something like this and deliberately brought her along as support. Fernan dismissed the idea outright, claiming that no one could foresee such chaotic events, and made it clear that whether her suspicions were right or wrong held no importance to him. When she pressed further, asking if the elixir truly mattered more than his own life, he responded with unsettling certainty, treating its importance as unquestionable before charging ahead without hesitation, leaving Lena stunned by what she could only describe as reckless madness. The scene shifted once more as they reached the location Fernan had identified as the resting place of the cursed elixir. Though he recognized the surroundings, it quickly became apparent that they had arrived too late, as the confrontation with Ain't had already concluded. Luina soon noticed a figure lying motionless on the ground and, overcome with concern, moved to approach despite Fernan's warning. Upon getting closer, she realized it was Varian, astonished that someone of his strength had been reduced to such a state and wondering who could have done this to him. Determined to help, she attempted to assist him, but Fernan firmly insisted she keep her distance. Even so, Luina could not bring herself to abandon an unconscious person in such a dangerous place, especially with berserk monsters roaming nearby. At that moment, Varian suddenly rose, his expression twisted in a way that immediately set off alarm bells. Acting on instinct, Luina leapt back, overwhelmed by an oppressive aura unlike anything she had ever encountered. Fernan instantly recognized it for what it was, the unmistakable presence of demonic energy, while Luina realized that the dark, suffocating aura before her was something only a demon could possess. Fernan confirmed that Varian had indeed fallen under demonic possession, recalling that the prophecy had stated he would pursue Ain't once overtaken. Yet it was clear in that moment that his target had shifted. Luina immediately grasped the severity of the situation, realizing that their priority had to be subduing Varian as quickly as possible before things spiraled further out of control. Fernan, however, asked her to hold out for 10 minutes, and before she could even question what he meant, he had already disappeared from sight. Meanwhile, Varian, now consumed by demonic energy, launched himself at Luina with unrestrained fury, forcing her into a direct confrontation where she quickly realized that his strength had far surpassed what it once was. With limited options, she attempted to create distance before leaping back in, striking him with enough force in hopes of snapping him out of his state. Yet instead of weakening, his power only surged further, driving him to retaliate with brutal intensity. Their clash grew increasingly violent, with neither side gaining a clear advantage. But Luina soon became aware that her mana was draining rapidly, while Varian's demonic energy showed no signs of exhaustion. As desperation began to set in, she struggled to think of a way out of the situation, only for Fernan to suddenly reappear, calling out to her. Frustrated and pushed to her limits, Luina slammed her foot down onto Varian's head to hold him in place before turning on Fernan, furious at his sudden return after abandoning her in the midst of such a dangerous fight. Remaining composed, Fernan explained that he had not fled for his own safety, but had instead been preparing a method to restrain Varian, knowing full well that someone possessed by a demon would not be easily subdued. At that precise moment, Varian activated the trap Fernan had set. His body violently lifted into the air before a barrage of fire darts struck him mid-flight, sending him crashing back down with tremendous force. Luina, breathing heavily, voiced her frustration, arguing that such extreme measures were unnecessary and questioning what would happen if Varian were killed in the process. But Fernan reassured her with quiet confidence, insisting that someone like him would not fall so easily. In reality, the attack only seemed to fuel his rage even further. Fernan, growing increasingly tense, admitted to himself that he had hoped to avoid using his final measure, yet circumstances left him no alternative. He unleashed a surge of fire so intense that even Luina was caught off guard, watching as the flames struck Varian's head and engulfed his body before he collapsed to the ground, completely still. Satisfied, Fernan concluded that the operation had been a success, though Luina reacted with visible frustration, questioning whether the costly materials used in the trap hadn't been an outrageous waste. Fernan maintained that there had been no other viable option in that moment. But Luina argued that if they had coordinated from the beginning, they could have subdued Varian without expending such valuable resources. Fernan dismissed the idea, insisting that it would not have worked regardless, as someone possessed by a demon would never yield so easily. As Luina continued voicing her complaints, Fernan's thoughts drifted elsewhere, unsettled by how events had unfolded. According to the prophecy, Ain't Armian was supposed to be the one confronting the possessed Varian, yet the situation had deviated from that expectation. Upon reconsideration, he realized that although Ain't was destined to become the world's savior, he was still only a first-year student who had yet to fully awaken his potential, whereas Luina, being in her second year, naturally held the advantage in strength for now. That realization only deepened his irritation, as it meant he had squandered a fortune on magical tools unnecessarily. He begrudgingly admitted that his fixation on the word demon had clouded his judgment, causing him to overlook the most important factor, the sheer cost of everything he had just used. Before he could dwell on it any further, Varian unexpectedly rose again, seemingly unaffected by everything he had endured, and charged at them once more. Already on edge from the financial loss, Fernan snapped, stepping forward and delivering a direct punch to Varian's face that knocked him unconscious instantly. The scene then shifted to Varian himself, who appeared to be observing the entire sequence of events from a detached perspective, as though he were nothing more than a spectator to his own actions. He struggled to accept that the person he had just witnessed could truly be himself. Sensing that something was deeply wrong, Fernan calmly clarified that the recording sphere had captured every detail of the incident exactly as it happened, leaving no room for distortion or deception. Still disoriented, Varian admitted he had no memory of anything after his battle with Ain Armian, prompting Fernan to patiently explain that this was precisely why he was laying everything out for him. He revealed that following his defeat, Varian had been overtaken by a demon and had begun attacking indiscriminately. Varian, however, remained in disbelief, insisting he had never encountered a demon in his life, and questioned how Fernan could be so certain of such a claim. With calculated composure, Fernan pointed out that the answer should have been obvious, reminding him that it had endured a direct explosion, been pierced by numerous magical projectiles, and burned by an overwhelming surge of flames, yet had somehow survived it all, which could only be explained by demonic energy shielding his body in an unnatural way. He further added that several specialized artifacts had been used to forcibly expel the demon from within him. Hearing this, Varian hesitantly questioned whether those same costly items that had nearly killed him were now his responsibility to repay. In response, Fernan suddenly shifted demeanor, putting on an exaggerated display of distress as he lamented the immense burden he had endured, claiming that the financial and emotional toll of saving Varian from such a threat had been overwhelming. Caught off guard and clearly uncomfortable, Varian conceded and asked what he could possibly do to make amends. Wasting no time, Fernan presented a solution in the form of a contract, which Varian reluctantly took and began to read, only for his expression to turn to shock upon realizing it was a document binding him into servitude. Without any trace of hesitation, Fernan explained that refusal would leave only one alternative: settling the matter through official channels, which would involve presenting the recorded evidence to the Inquisitors, an organization that operated under the direct authority of the Emperor and was tasked with identifying and eradicating demonic threats. Because no trace of demons had surfaced for over 1,000 years, the Inquisitors had gradually lost their influence, leaving them eager for any opportunity to reclaim their former authority. Varian desperately insisted that he had no connection to demons, but Fernan continued his explanation without wavering, pointing out that mere possession would be enough to have him expelled from the academy without any chance to defend himself. He further pressed the issue by questioning whether Varian's own father would even acknowledge a son tainted by such an incident. Faced with that harsh reality, Varian finally understood there was no escape, lowering his head as he accepted his fate and agreed to sign the contract, submitting himself under Fernan's authority. Luina, who had silently observed everything unfold, questioned whether this course of action was truly justified, suggesting it might be better to report the truth to the instructors. Fernan, however, dismissed the idea, explaining that time was too limited and that his priority was to determine whether Varian had willingly embraced the demon's power or had been manipulated into it. As he reflected on the situation, he considered the possibility that if manipulation was involved, it would mean someone within the academy was secretly collaborating with demons. He reasoned that exposing the incident prematurely would only give the real perpetrators a chance to conceal themselves more effectively, making them far harder to track down. Luina then questioned why demons would target an academy student in the first place, to which Fernan concluded that the academy gathered the most promising talents in the empire, making it an ideal target, as corrupting or eliminating those individuals would be equivalent to undermining the empire's future. Hearing this, Luina's expression hardened with resolve as she affirmed that he could rely on her when it came to eradicating demons. Fernan felt a quiet sense of satisfaction, realizing that with her resolve now secured, he would not need to offer anything further in exchange for her cooperation. The scene then shifted to the aftermath of the chaos, where teachers and assistants struggled to restore order among the shaken students following the outbreak of rampaging monsters. As a result of the incident, the midterm examination for the first-year Knights Department was ultimately canceled, though the Academy could not afford to halt evaluations entirely, leading to the practical assessments being replaced with written tests. This change created significant difficulty for many students, as the Academy traditionally placed far greater emphasis on practical ability than theoretical knowledge, turning the written exams into a heavy burden for nearly everyone, including Aint, who found himself equally affected. Observing the situation, Ego remarked that no matter how one analyzed it, the berserk monsters were undoubtedly the work of a demon, recalling that he had sensed a faint trace of demonic energy lingering in the area despite the demon itself remaining unseen. Ain't, still trying to make sense of everything, considered the possibility that if no demon had appeared, perhaps it was not one at all, but Ego firmly rejected that notion, insisting such conclusion was impossible and that demons would inevitably resurface. He went on to explain that this very inevitability was why the first emperor had positioned him there, fully aware that demons would one day return to the world. Curious yet unsettled, Ain't questioned why they would always come back, to which Ego answered that demons harbored a deep, instinctive hatred for the Armian lineage, viewing it as their greatest enemy. Without the Armians standing in their way, the demons would have nothing preventing them from seizing control of the entire world, making it only natural that they would attempt to eradicate that bloodline first. Troubled by this revelation, Ain't began to wonder if his very existence might be acting as a beacon, drawing demons back into the world. Meanwhile, in another part of the academy within the Ravidos Hall, Fernan was consumed by anxiety, his thoughts racing to the point where it felt as though his head might split under the pressure. Noticing his troubled expression, Hyde questioned what could possibly be weighing so heavily on him. Fernan had just experienced another vision of the future, one that revealed the first-year students being sent to the southern forest for a week-long survival training exercise. Within that vision, he saw Ain't venturing deep into a mysterious cave, where he would come face to face with a massive spiritual beast. The prophecy also mentioned a thief masquerading as a master, a detail that felt overwhelming for Fernan to process at that moment. In the vision, Ain't was ultimately forced to retreat, and in doing so, a hidden crack within the cave wall exposed a rare, or known as a mana-blessed metal. Alongside it, Fernan noticed a sword forged from that very material, and more intriguingly, it appeared that a soul had been bound within the blade itself. This revelation left him deeply unsettled, unable to comprehend how a mere metal could contain a soul, yet the very absurdity of it sparked the beginnings of a plan in his mind. Acting without delay, Fernan sought out Luina to discuss what he had seen, but upon arriving, she greeted him with clear skepticism, reminding him how he had previously claimed to need a spiritual elixir, only to now speak of a spiritual herb instead. Fernan admitted without hesitation that he had lied before, though he insisted that this time his claim was genuine, explaining that the upcoming survival training would last an entire week.